Today we are back talking about poultry. It's spring and it's a timely subject because a lot of people think about raising birds this time of year. But today we are going to talk about the differences between raising ducks and raising geese. So before we get right into it, I'm just going to lay out what I'm thinking of talking about here. Things that I think if you're looking at sort of comparing ducks and geese, these are things to consider. And basically what they are kind of listed off is water consumption, breeding, foraging or ability to forage and / feeding, temperament, which I think is going to be a huge one, productivity, which may be a little hard to compare, and predator issues or susceptibility to predators. So we're going to get right into it and kind of look at each one of these in relation to ducks and geese. It's not really a which one's better. This is just some things to think about because I think ducks and geese in particular are not the first poultry people think about raising by any means, but they both have some really good positive or strong points and a few things to consider. So thing number one, water. Both ducks and geese are waterfowl, which makes sense. They both have big web feet and they consume a lot of water. Now I will say, when you compare the two together, ducks, at least the mallard derived breeds, are far more consumptive of water than geese are. Geese and ducks both have an oil gland at the base of their tail, which I mentioned in the last video about chickens versus ducks, which makes water an important component of keeping them in good shape. If they don't have access to water, neither of them will stay in amazing feather condition because they need water to spread that oil around on their feathers. Now, ducks, again, mallard-derived ducks, really prefer to get in and fully bathe. While geese also enjoy bathing, they can be successfully raised with enough water that their head can become fully submerged because they are basically better at moving that oil around their body with less water. That's sort of your day-to-day water use. Obviously, both ducks and geese are going to consume far more water than chickens. So this is just compared to the two of them. Now, the one part that kind of gets interesting with this is when you get into the breeding season. Again, with mallard-derived ducks and most of the goose breeds, if you have water that they can actually get into, like a container, or you don't absolutely need a pond, but something that they can get into, when you get to the breeding season, your success rate at successful breedings will go up, especially when you get into some of the heavier goose breeds. If I had to say which one will consume more, it's definitely the ducks. Now, Muscovies, throw that monkey wrench into everything because they still like to bathe. They still need the water to spread the oil around, but they are, I'm going to say it this way, a bit more of a terrestrial duck and are a little bit more on the chicken side of things. Although, compared to a chicken, they are still going to go through a ton of water. Point number two, we're going to talk about feeding and foraging ability. All breeds of ducks and all breeds of geese are all pretty good foragers. They're very, I'm not going to say efficient, but they're very good at going out and foraging for food. That being said, they have slightly different diets, and while geese do consume some insects at certain times of the year, generally speaking, geese are about the only, and somebody may be able to find another bird in the world, but they're about the only group of birds that are almost 100% herbivores. Geese eat plants, and that makes geese a little bit easier on a small scale to feed, with some challenges. Ducks, on the other hand, of all breeds and species, eat a little bit more animal matter. And so where we find ducks more difficult is not so much in the growing season. If you live in an area that has green grass growing all year round, ducks may actually be very easy. Now, that being said, geese may be even easier because you have that green grass that they like to eat all year round. But when you live in an environment where you have winter, ducks can be a little bit more difficult to feed than the geese because they still require, I'm going to say, a higher protein because they would naturally eat more animal matter. And unlike chickens, as we discussed last time, getting that into them can be a little bit more difficult. So really from a feeding perspective, I would suggest geese are far easier. The downside is, geese being big birds, they do best when they have access to pasture. So geese are one of these unique poultry that is almost better described or better looked at as a big grazing animal than it is as a conventional poultry, because they will use pasture very well. Now, can you raise geese on pasture alone? That's a bit debatable, because what you will find, and if you watch wild geese, you'll see the exact same thing. Their preferences will change ever so slightly throughout the year. So that's something to keep in mind, because the quality of your pasture for geese is really going to affect your ability for them to eat a forage-based diet year-round. But if I had to compare the two, I would say the outside supplementation, or the extra that is needed to raise geese, i.e. the grains or pelleted feeds or whatever you're choosing to add to the diet, the need is less with geese than it is with ducks, which is interesting, because if you think historically, geese were raised, at least in Europe, far more abundantly and on a much bigger scale than ducks were. And something to think about, because that's kind of one of those old-timey little tidbits that could be applied to modern homesteading. So point number 3, and I think this is going to be an interesting one for people, because this is where I think there's a big difference between raising geese and ducks, and that's breeding. So when you get into ducks, and it doesn't matter whether it's Muscovies or Mallards, yes, they will pair up for a short period of time, but in both cases, the male provides no parental care whatsoever. And in fact, for anybody who has raised ducks of both species, they will know that male ducks can be extremely, I'm going to say it, promiscuous. So you can use, depending on the breed of duck, because usually the bigger the breed, the less active they are, for lack of a better way to put it, you can use one male with multiple females, very similar to chickens. In fact, I'm going to say it, ducks are probably the more aggressive breeders when you compare them to chickens. Geese, on the other hand, have a completely different strategy. And although you will read some stuff that sort of allows you to play with this a bit, basically what geese want to do is form a pair, and both the male and the female will look after the young. So if you're using natural incubation to produce your birds, the big difference there, at least from our perspective and our experience raising both, is with the ducks, it's you basically leave them together with the females until the female has her clutch of eggs set and she's ready to sit, and then at that point it actually is easier to take the male out, put him in a bachelor group away from the hens, because at that point all he's going to do is be an annoyance. He's not really providing any extra service to the hen. She's better off left by herself. But in the case of geese, it's the opposite. That gander is the guard, and I think that's where geese get this bad reputation of being kind of nasty, is in the spring. That's exactly what he's supposed to do. He's deterring predators, but he's also keeping other males away, which is a whole nother thing of itself, because with ducks, you don't get that same male-on-male aggression as you do with geese. Geese are, for lack of a better term, a little more territorial, which can bring us to another point we'll touch on in a minute. But those different breeding styles, I think neither one's better, neither one's worse in of itself. But you have to ask yourself, how do you want to manage your birds? Because if you want to do sort of the flock mating, I'm going to suggest the ducks are the easier option. If you are willing to have the pairs and separate them out, the geese are definitely the easier option. But it's really what works best for you and your available space. Keeping in mind, as we just said before, the geese are going to require a bigger area, because frankly, they're a bigger bird, quite a bit bigger in many cases than the ducks. So the next topic, I think, is probably the one that people's minds go to most commonly when they think of geese, and that's temperament. So I'm going to start with ducks. And I think the one thing about ducks, which I think, whether it's Muscovies or Mallard Drive breeds, is, I'm going to say it this way, for having had ducks for so many years, of all the livestock you could ever own, and I'm including rabbits and bigger livestock, etc., ducks are the one that really, unless you are physically grabbing them, in which case you might get scratched by toenails, they can't hurt you. They can't hurt your kids. They are the safest, I'm going to say it, type of livestock that I can think of, or commonly kept livestock, that you could possibly imagine. They can't bite. They don't attack you. They can't really do anything. So from a temperament related to humans, ducks definitely win hands down. Now, temperament with each other can be a little bit interesting or fun to deal with, because as I said, during the breeding season, both Muscovies and Mallard Drive breeds are very promiscuous. And the more hens you have, I'm going to say it this way, the worse they can be. And some breeds, in our experience, such as Khaki Campbell ducks, which are heavy layers, that's magnified. So they can be very difficult if you're not prepared to separate and potentially limit your numbers. They can be very difficult once the breeding's done and those drakes still want to breed. They can be very difficult to manage because of that aspect. But as I said, they can't really hurt you as a person. Geese, on the other side, are completely different. Even though geese and ducks are distantly related, being types of waterfowl, geese, I think, get an unfair negativity applied to them because realistically, they're not a dangerous livestock. Can they bite? Yes. Can they hit you with their wings? Yes. Are they going to likely inflict serious damage on you? No, they're not. There's a little bit more bluff there, and I think the other problem with that is when you get into the spring period, you need to expect the increased aggression. And I don't know that everybody's always willing to tolerate that in a way. But geese can definitely be more aggressive, particularly the ganders, because they get more possessive. They're more territorial at that time of year. What we typically find, though, is once the testosterone levels drop, which is fairly soon after the babies are hatched and sort of out doing their thing, they're still protective of the babies. Don't get us wrong there. But the testosterone levels drop fairly quickly, and geese are very easy to manage. They're not overly aggressive, so that aggressiveness is a seasonal aggression in most cases. But every now and then you will get a goose that is a bit of a jerk. You have to make the decision. Is it worth keeping that animal? That's up to you. So the next point about ducks versus geese is productivity, and I'm going to start off by saying, compared to chickens, there are far fewer breeds of ducks and geese. It's just the reality of it. And I think part of that may go back to the space requirements and potentially water, because historically you had to have a water source to have them. But you also had to have space. Geese require a lot of space. So you can kind of see that you only really developed most of those breeds through regional selection and isolation. Yeah, it wasn't as easy to have one or two breeders sort of develop something new like often happens with chickens. But that being said, despite the fact that there are fewer breeds, there is quite a diversity of practical traits to both chickens and ducks. I mean, meat is kind of, I think, first and foremost in a lot of people's minds, because people are fairly used, or people used to be quite accustomed to eating wild waterfowl. But meat's not the only thing. I think when it comes to meat, it's very hard to really say which one is better. They are very similar. Typically, geese are larger, but not always. There are breeds of ducks that are larger than some breeds of geese. So you have to keep that in mind. Geese will take longer to grow to that optimal size than most ducks, but both types of waterfowl are actually fairly fast growing. Unlike chickens, they tend to put on most of their size quite early and then they feather out, whereas most of you who maybe raise chickens know chickens have a tendency to get to a certain size, then start putting on their feathers, then they continue to fill out. So really, I think it comes down to comparing breeds on the meat side of things. Now, ducks and geese can both provide oil, which is something that, although yes, you can make oil from the fat of chickens, unless you like that chicken flavor, it tends to have that flavor, basically, is where I'm going with it. Whereas goose in particular is kind of the opposite spectrum. There's very little flavor to it. So geese can, and we're big advocates of this, geese can really produce you a very healthy, if they're pasture raised, oil or fat that you can use in a phenomenal range of cooking applications. And I think historically, that is one of the biggest reasons, that coupled with the fact that they're mostly grazers and fairly big birds, so you get quite a bit back in return for the amount of investment of time and effort. Now the other part is eggs, because both ducks and geese have been developed to be egg layers, and it doesn't take you too much to find that some duck breeds will outlay even the most productive chicken laying breeds. Geese, not quite so much. There are laying breeds such as the Chinese goose, which lay a lot more eggs than most of their relatives, like a lot of the European breeds, but they still won't keep pace the number of eggs as ducks or chickens, and they're a little more seasonal than chickens. But you also have to keep in mind, a goose egg is like 2 to 3 times the size of a chicken egg, so there's tons of trade-offs there. So I think productivity is a tough one to really say which one's better, because you're really going to have to look at why do you want them, and then find breeds that fit that niche. Now the other thing that both produce, and I'm going to say geese produce maybe a little bit better quality just because they have more feathers on them, is the down, which is not something that in modern times most people think about, but it's a high value product if you live in a cold area. So last but not least on this list of sort of differences is predators. Predators are definitely something to consider, because the vast majority of domestic waterfowl, whether they're ducks or geese, do not have the ability to fly well. It's something that just as they've gotten larger, the wing area to body weight ratio on a duck or a goose is far closer than a chicken. That's a whole nother topic for another day. But predators are something to consider. Both are quite susceptible to ground predators. I am going to say it that for the most part, if you were to generalize, I would say geese are less predator prone. And I say that with a bit of hesitation because there's some big caveats to that. But typically, geese aren't attractive to a lot of the aerial predators, unless you live in an area with a high sort of bald eagle or golden eagle population. That's about the only thing we've ever seen that may even eye them up. They're just too big, to be honest. Your average bird of prey just can't tackle them unless there's something seriously wrong with them. Geese are also significantly less predator prone to aerial predators when they're babies, because if they have 2 parents in attendance who are looking after them really well, it's very hard for an aerial predator to get in between the parents and the babies to grab one. So although it can certainly happen, they are very safe in the daytime out on pasture from aerial predators. Now ground predators are a whole different topic, because both are susceptible here. Geese are slightly better for a lot of your smaller predators, because a lot of them will think twice about tackling the parents, for lack of a better way to put it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they won't. But when you get into larger predators, such as coyotes and dogs in particular, geese can't hold their own against that. If those kind of predators realize, hey, I have a source that I can go and get those, they can still carry them off, and they're still physically bigger. So whether you're raising geese or ducks, one thing we would strongly recommend is you have them in a fenced-in area, a 4-foot fence, so that their pastures are not accessible. And I know people may comment that, coyotes can jump a fence, dogs can jump a fence. True, they can, but a 4-foot fence goes a long way to preventing that. A lot of those type of predators are far less likely to try, especially in the daytime. Now, at night, I would say you still need to lock them up. even if you are in a fenced-in area, because you really don't know. Now, ducks and geese, unlike chickens, stay kind of active at night, and that's another thing to consider. If you don't lock them up at night, if something disturbs them, you're going to hear about it. So they may still be okay out in that pasture at night, but you're going to hear them talk when something comes to check them out. Ducks, I really am going to say, are probably more predator prone than even chickens. And the reason for that is ducks tend to like to be out in the open. And like I said, most of them can't fly. And the hen provides parental care, but if she has a large brood, it's very hard for her to keep track of everybody. So something to think about. They are more appealing to aerial predators, and as many of you know, we had some very serious issues with ducks, even with ravens, which are not typically considered to be sort of birds of prey. So that goes back to my comment earlier about sort of temperament. Ducks are basically defenseless, whereas geese at least have a little bit of a bite to the bark, for lack of a better way to put it. So before we end, I'm going to give one more bonus point that I didn't mention earlier on, and that's guard geese, because this is a topic that comes up a lot. Now, this is just my opinion from raising both ducks and geese and other poultry over the years of what I think of guard geese. Now, historically, I'm going to say it, geese are a very good deterrent for humans. And the reason for that is they're very attuned to what's going on around them. They're very observant. We find most of the poultry that we've raised kind of in a pasture type situation, whether it's chickens, ducks, geese, turkeys, etc. They're all observant. They are keeping track of what's going on around them. But the geese are like hyper observant. Turkey vulture flies by and it gets somebody's attention. Something walks through the bush and they at least acknowledge that it's there. So from a human perspective, I mean, there are cases in the past where there have been raids thwarted by geese, sounding the alarm. They're not really guarding, but they're letting you know. I think that right there is an important point because geese definitely have the potential to be louder than ducks. We didn't talk about voice, but geese definitely can be louder, but they tend to only be loud when there's a reason for it. Now that reason could be fighting amongst themselves, or it could be that there's a predator afoot. So that can be used to your advantage. But when in the modern context, a lot of people talk about raising geese with other poultry to guard them, to protect their poultry. And what I have seen is I'm not 100% sure that that actually works out exactly as people would like it to. And what I mean by that is typically the geese aren't super attached to those other poultry. So where they kind of work as a deterrent is if they are in the same general vicinity, i.e. when we let our chickens out to forage behind the barn in our little pasture area there, the geese are out with them. The chickens watch the geese. And if the geese start to act whatever about an aerial predator, for example, the chickens will run for cover. Or they'll come towards the geese. But the geese are not doing anything proactive to defend the chickens. In fact, if the geese are in another area and the chickens are off doing their thing, they're not going to come to the chickens' rescue. So where they work as a deterrent is, like I said, in relation to aerial predators. They're just too big and they're intimidating. So most of the aerial predators, at least in North America, aren't going to test their luck with it. And so most predators will do that kind of calculation in their head, for lack of a better way to put it, of is it worth the risk? And when the goose is standing right there, or a pair of geese or a flock of geese is standing right there amongst the ducks or the chickens, they're going to think twice. And so without getting into any particulars about it, and maybe we'll do a video on this later, I think that's where geese excel as a guard animal, is just their presence being such a large bird in the pasture or the poultry yard can be a deterrent, but they're not going to necessarily be a proactive predator deterrent. And you might get into some situations, depending on how close of confinement you have, where they could actually cause issues with your other poultry. So something to think about there too. But anyways, that's it. That's some things that we've kind of compiled, or I've kind of compiled, that I've either seen, experienced, or thought about over the years of raising ducks and geese. And spoiler alert, I would suggest that depending on your space availability, and I'm going to say it, whether or not you have chickens, because if you have chickens and ducks are very similar with some differences. But if you choose to raise ducks over chickens, then ducks and geese can actually complement each other very well. But if you have chickens, geese may be the more logical option because they are going to produce you a different kind of food without competing directly with your chickens for some of your other resources. Whereas we found this in years past, the ducks and the chickens, they did compete with each other. So I still don't think ducks or geese are one is better than the other. But for us right now, with the property we have and the space allocation that we have and everything else considered, the geese are definitely the better option of waterfowl to raise. But I would strongly encourage anybody who's made it to this point in the video to consider raising waterfowl, because they've been raised for a very, very long time. But like I say, in modern sort of homesteading circles, they're not necessarily the go-to animals, but they can bring a lot to your homestead and definitely bring you some products that you maybe didn't even think you needed or could even produce yourself.